Don't worry, this video isn't going to be nearly as intelligent as that ridiculous title suggests. As I write this, it's been almost exactly 24 hours since Chester Bennington's body was discovered. For those who weren't alive in the 2000s, Bennington is most known for being a vocalist for the band Linkin Park, a band that I have visually joked about several times on this YouTube channel. These jokes have aged badly, to say the least, and if anything I have to say here is worthy as an opening statement, the best contender is probably an apology to those affected that I, along with many other people who saw Linkin Park's blunt approach to writing about pain and angst as humorously clumsy, trivialized, albeit unintentionally, what Chester was going through. This is a terrible way to come to that realization, but it worked. This has been a process that a lot of people who dislike or were apathetic towards Linkin Park, except perhaps as a joke, have been going through, and it's a process that's been through an incredible amount of bombardment of scrutiny from both sides of the aisle. Firstly, there's those who, while they respectfully acknowledge the tragedy of any suicide, say that it's intellectually wrong-headed and illogical to return to the band's music with more positive feelings. After all, it's just the cheap afterglow of a celebrity death, and you shouldn't allow bias to work into your judgment. The music should speak for itself and must be judged separately via death of the author, even through the literal death of the author. The second objection comes from fans of Bennington's work who feel that those who came around to it after his death are not only less legitimate, but that this bandwagoning trend is actively disrespectful to him and comes not from a place of genuine empathy for the pain in his music, which they have recognized for years, but rather a cheap, artificial repentance that doesn't come close to making up for all the mockery and negativity that, yes, was probably a contributing factor in Bennington's decision to end his life. That first objection comes from a trend that I find incredibly frustrating and intellectually backwards. There's no name for this trend that I know of, although I would say it's a terrible offshoot of Death of the Author school of thought. It's those critical thinkers who are eternally afraid of bias. That first objection comes from a trend of nostalgia and ideas about the artist's overall body of work into their assessment. These critics strive for a purity of experience. You'll often hear them say that the work should speak for itself, taking it to the extent that nothing outside the work in question should be included in their evaluation, because that would be bias, and all bias is bad. There are numerous problems with this. First of all, as I've said on this channel before, you will never, ever, 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 ever experience anything in a vacuum. Unless you reject the field of psychology wholesale, you have to concede that you have billions of tiny biases working at you every moment of every day, all drawing from past experiences. I would argue that without past experiences, you could not judge something on its own merits, because you would have no frame of reference for the work or how to judge it. It would be meaningless. The purity of experience that these people are striving for either does not exist or isn't very helpful. Secondly, even moving up from that kind of pedantic level, I see no reason why any factor, even ultra-subjective ones, should be simply left out of an opinion piece. Not only is that the kind of personal intellectual expression that I find to be really fascinating and infectious, but the decision that these types of things are less worthy simply because they can't be academically studied is completely arbitrary and speaks, ironically, to biases. So, no. I don't think it's anti-intellectual to have your personal experience of Linkin Park's self-loathing become a lot more potent when it's driven terribly, terribly home that it was coming from a very real place. Last year, similar discussions were being had about whether it's fair to consider David Bowie's death into an assessment of Black Star, to which I would say any answer other than an automatic yes is a bad answer, because you're trying to dictate the personal experience of others in such a way as to tell them you can't enjoy this as much as you did if you were moved by the self-conscious swan song of a dying man just because he was dying. You're biased, and your experience has no place in a review. I hope I don't have to explain why that's completely unempathic garbage. The second concern, that of exasperated Linkin Park fans, comes from a much more reasonable and understandable place, and one that I have a lot of sympathy for. I can't even imagine what it would be like to have I Love, a band that may have gotten me into music in the first place, one that spoke wildly to my emotional experiences, to not only be alternately vilified as the worst thing to happen to mainstream rock, or dismissed as teenage pandering, unintentionally funny angst, but for the requirement for that behavior to calm down being the tragic death of one of its members. Not only are you dealing with a bunch of people who've been mocking something you've held dear for years suddenly coming around to what you've always seen, but you're still reeling from the death itself. It's a terrible position to be in. That being said, I still disagree with most of the accusations that come from that position. Unlike the first objection, it revolves around the disregard of other people's experiences, in a somewhat concealed form of the hipster objection. Hipster has rightfully fallen out of unironic use, as it's an absolutely reprehensible word that most people, including myself, associate the use of with complete insufferability, but it still pops up in principle if not in wording. The short of it is, you're questioning the validity of other people's enjoyment and accusing them of not being real, which is a hefty accusation that requires more insight and evidence that most people who call upon it are able to provide. It comes most often from a snap judgment about bandwagons, the idea that because someone enjoys a thing that's popular and first heard about it because it's been popular recently, they must just be pretending to be enjoying it, to be cool, which is frankly a terrible assumption to jump to. I advise people who feel this way to take it as a case-by-case thing and give people the benefit of the doubt. The emotional recontextualization of death has a lot of gravity. It's a powerful thing. It's bound to affect many people legitimately. As for the mockery and derision being a contributing factor in Chester's suicide, yeah, you got me there. The only thing I can say about it is that it's in the past, and I can only hope some of us learn a thing or two about how we detect real emotions, bro, versus pandering commercial garbage. I know I have. While I, of course, don't wish death on Chester, or anyone, I don't think it's inherently disrespectful to get something positive out of his death, from positive musical experience to positive personal and critical growth. Refusing to acknowledge the good things that can spurt from a tragic event will not undo the tragic event. It's just wasteful. Lastly, I'd like to reach out to the numerous people who were respectful about the death, but still don't feel anything particularly new about a band that they disliked or were apathetic about. These people often feel like they can't contribute to the train of sympathy because they simply don't have a lot of positive things to say other than death is generally sad. I would like to encourage you to think about the effects of Chester's music beyond yourself. Linkin Park, even if you and I were inclined to joke about them for a long time, genuinely means a lot to a lot of people. They may have gotten into music through them, or into certain genres through them. They may have listened to them in times of depression and suicidal thoughts, finding solace in how their feelings are shared and they're not the only ones to go through this. They may have met lifelong friends or romantic partners through being fans. Say what you want about Linkin Park, but while other nu metal acts came and went, they stuck around. They really resonated with people. You don't get that big of an emotionally receptive audience without contributing positively to many people's lives. And that's more of a legacy than most people could ever hope to have. And that's worth celebrating.